Good morning and welcome back to World Talks. As promised, we're going to discuss the latest on Serbia. Thousands from towns in Serbia, Kosovo and Bosnia arrived by buses on Saturday to attend a rally in Belgrade organized in support of President Aleksandar Vučić. This comes in response to months of protests against Vučić and his regime that have been going on in Serbia. To discuss these recent developments, I have James Ker-Lindsay, visiting professor, University of Kent, joining me right now. Good morning, Professor. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
So we have protests and counter-protests, support rallies, and so on. If you were to assess how robust, or to the contrary, how fragile the regime of Aleksandar Vučić is, what would that be?
Well, I think the important thing in these situations, as we know from other examples, is that regimes can appear very robust until they aren't. I think the clearest example we had was the Assad regime, of course, which looked actually relatively safe. And then suddenly, within the space of a couple of weeks, it collapsed. But I think overall, the regime in Serbia, the government in Serbia is probably far more robust than many outsiders would rather like to see it as such. So Aleksandar Vučić is obviously a very divisive character. There are many who criticize him internationally. But I think internally in Serbia, we are definitely seeing opposition to the government. But I don't think it's probably quite as significant as many might like to see it, either in Serbia or outside.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that these changes that Vučić has been introducing, and here I mean, for instance, the new prime minister, right, Đuro Macut, if I'm not mispronouncing it, he's an endocrinologist. That's an interesting choice, right, for a new prime minister following Vučević. Do you think that these changes will translate into Vučić staying in power longer, and will the situation calm down? And if so, what is the time frame on that?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that officially on paper, Serbia is a parliamentary system. It's a hybrid, like in many countries. So the president has a degree of power, but traditionally, the prime minister was more in charge of day-to-day implementation of policy. But I think what we've seen under Vučić is that a lot of that power has been centralized on the president. So in many ways, I wouldn't like to say the prime minister is merely a figurehead, but in many ways, the prime minister is merely a figurehead. It's not quite as significant a role as it would usually be expected to be constitutionally. So I think this is important to bear in mind. This then becomes another figure that, if needs be, can take responsibility for things and almost become, if you like, a way that President Vučić can say, well, look, I listened to your complaints, and if heads have got to roll, then you can get rid of a prime minister. So it can actually be quite a useful role. So I'm not necessarily sure I'd want to be taking the post of prime minister at the moment.
Right, absolutely. And let me ask you, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has expressed yet again his support for Vučić and his regime. He actually addressed the people who rallied by a video link and said, Serbian patriots can count on Hungarian patriots. Is this something that we should be worried about? I mean, these, well, maybe not completely authoritarian, but somewhat authoritarian rulers, right? I mean, sort of bandwagoning together.
It's very, very interesting, this friendship between Aleksandar Vučić and Viktor Orbán. And I think on the surface, it's very tempting to make that link and sort of see them as, if you like, two sides of the same coin. But my sense has always been is that Vučić is rather different from Orbán. Orbán is in many ways a much more disturbing character, if I can be very honest. And especially as Hungary is an EU member. I think Vučić, it strikes me much more that Vučić is the sort of person who wants to be loved. He feels that he has made significant changes in Serbia. And to be fair, he has. The Serbian economy has grown enormously. Many ordinary Serbs will tell you their standard of living, their quality of life has improved significantly under Aleksandar Vučić, especially compared with the liberal democratic government that had been in power before him. So I think that often shapes the way that Vucic behaves, and he wants to, as I say, be adored. He wants to be recognised for what he's done, and he doesn't take criticism very well. But I think that his natural inclination is much more sort of towards European Union membership and reforming in that way. Whereas I think Hungary, it's going in a very, very different direction. But you're right, it's very interesting that the two have built this relationship between each other.
And you've mentioned the European Union. I was wondering because, I mean, it seems that Serbia was towing this line between, Russia and the EU, perhaps, trying to maintain some form of a balance. So do you think that if Vucic stays in power, will Serbia eventually join the EU? Will EU have them?
Well, obviously, EU membership, it's a huge task, and there's a whole range of things that have got to be completed. I can remember a decade ago when everyone was saying, well, Serbia could be a member of the European Union by 2025, and here we are, it's not a member. We've seen a dramatic slowing of EU membership talks across the Western Balkans. So it's very, very difficult to say when it will join. But you're right. I mean, there are a number of elements that Serbia will have to follow as part of that process, and that will mean aligning with the European Union and taking European Union positions on questions such as Ukraine and Russia. But I think it's also important to note that, Serbia treads a very fine balance. It needs Russia's support because of Kosovo. Serbia has rejected Kosovo's independence, and it needs Russia to prevent Kosovo from joining the United Nations. But in other ways, Serbia has actually been much more closely linked with the West and much more behind the scenes. So, for example, Serbia has a fairly significant arms industry. It's been supplying Ukraine with a lot of weapons. So, I think there's sometimes a tendency, for Serbs to say we love Russia and everything. And reality is it's not as simple as that. But equally, for many outsiders, there's a tendency to say, oh, Serbia is pro-Russian. In reality, it's not as simple as that. Serbia treads, as I say, this very, very fine line, and it's not as knee-jerk pro-Russian as people often imagine. But on the other hand, it could be significantly more pro-Western, if you like.
And can we zoom in on sort of Western Balkans? Because recently Serbia also expelled Croatian diplomats. There's some tension there. What is this sort of the regional situation here?
Well, yes. I mean, so one of the things that we've seen over the past decade is that tensions between Serbia and Croatia have been growing, and there's been an arms race been developing. Serbia has been very, very unhappy about the fact that Kosovo, Albania and Croatia signed a defence agreement recently. Frankly, if we're to be very honest, it was a completely unnecessary agreement. It wasn't, Croatia and Albania are already parts of NATO. So if in the unlikely event there was any sort of conflict, they would be covered by that. And NATO stations forces in Kosovo. So this, was very much an unnecessary step that was quite clearly done to bait Serbia. But on the other hand, I mean, again, we come back to the thing that Serbia has taken a position. It refuses to engage in talks on NATO membership, although it is a member of Partnership for Peace. And it really stands out. I mean, if you look at a map of Europe, I mean, Bosnia isn't a member of NATO either, but that's because of the internal divisions, including the Bosnian Serb part. That Serbia is this sort of almost like this security black hole, certainly in the region, surrounded by NATO members. And yet Serbia, because of what happened over Kosovo in 1999, refuses to talk about NATO membership, which, personally speaking, I think is very unfortunate. I think at a time when we need European Union unity, I think Serbia as a NATO member would be a good thing. But, we aren't seeing that on the ground.
And what about Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina with the Republika Srpska and Milorad Dodik of all people? I mean...
Yes, exactly. I mean, we saw this court case against Dodik. He's been sentenced to jail. He went to Moscow and everyone thought, well, he's fled, but he hasn't. Bosnia is, as we know, another huge conversation that needs to be had. This is a country in deep malaise. It's stuck in the past. I think a lot of observers know that things have got to be done to sort out the political system, to move it along, get it on the path to EU membership. And we're just not seeing this, that it's caught in the past stagnant political disputes, and it's disputes across the political spectrum. It's not just, as I say, the Bosnian Serbs, although, Milorad Dodik is frankly a nuisance. But I think what we're seeing is just a reluctance across the political spectrum and amongst all the different, peoples of the country to engage in sort of sensible discussions about the reforms that would be necessary to take the country further forward.
Mm-hmm. Professor, and just to round up our discussion, let's go back to the internal situation in Serbia. There are reports of some protesters being beaten, one of them being a lawyer. Of course, then we had the Serbian students cycling to Strasbourg, right, in a move of trying to show their sort of the lack of support for Vucic. So how do you see this situation developing, moving forward, and will we see perhaps more violence towards the protesters?
Well, I think obviously we would hope that we wouldn't see violence, and I think so far it has been very limited. I think that my main question about these protests is what exactly do they stand for? It's almost like a rejection of politics. So the big problem in Serbia is that you have a government that, yes, a large section of society is growing tired of. Vucic has been in power for over 12 years now. But there isn't an opposition to speak of. The opposition is in disarray. They don't have any serious policies. They don't look like a credible alternative to the government. And I think that we're seeing a lot of this reflected in these protests. But while some of these protests might be pro-European, people have also pointed out that there's remarkably few EU flags in these protests. There's more Russian flags than I think any of us feel comfortable about. So it's very, very difficult to see where all this is going, because, as I say, we just don't really know what these protests, what the ultimate goal of them is. And taking a nihilist view of saying, well, we reject politics is not an alternative. Serbia, if you are to get rid of Vucic, it needs to be very clear as to what's going to come in its place, what their policy platform is. And I think a lot of international officials, and this is one of the things that we're seeing, are very, very concerned that, yes, they have their worries about the way that Vucic has been going, his limits on media freedom, but they feel they understand him and they can work with him. There's a real concern that maybe what could replace him could actually be far worse and even more nationalist and pro-Russian. And then we would have a much greater problem. So I think a lot of people also point this out, that the EU seems to favour Vucic, and one can understand why. He's a known entity and he's a known quantity, and many officials feel they can work with him. They might not always like what he does, but at least they know they can work with him. And frankly, at the moment, the alternative is really, really murky. And I don't think anyone in Europe wants to see more uncertainty at this stage.
Well, this is very interesting. Professor James Ker-Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.